Welcome to medieval sleepy history. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and let the quiet of the night carry you back to a time of stone castles and candlelit chambers. Tonight, we drift through the hidden corridors of royal courts, where kings ruled not only with power, but with unrestrained desire. Behind silk curtains and heavy doors, indulgence whispered more loudly than prayers. Let the past unfold slowly now, as we begin our journey into most secret lives of medieval kings. In the quiet hush of medieval halls, where tapestries muffled the wind's cold breath and the glow of candlelight shimmered softly against stone walls, power was not always worn like a crown. It lingered instead in the way one paused at a door, in the murmured commands given without raising a voice, in the slow reach for a goblet of wine poured by trembling hands. The medieval king, often perched atop a throne carved from oak and gilded in gold, was far more than just a ruler of men and lands. He was a man whose very word was divine, whose whims were law, and whose desires, once spoken, became reality no matter how strange, forbidden, or indulgent. This was an age when kingdoms were governed not just by strategy and bloodshed, but by appetite, and behind every polished court ceremony, beyond every jeweled banquet and carefully orchestrated procession, lay another world, darker, quieter, hidden in the shadows behind velvet drapes and thick stone walls. It was within these shadows that the true nature of many kings took shape. The medieval world was one of contradictions. Deeply pious, grotesquely indulgent, bound by religious law, yet ruled by men who saw themselves as God's chosen, and therefore beyond the judgment of other men. In public, a king might kneel before the altar, crossing himself with dutiful reverence. But in private, he might indulge in acts that would send any commoner to the gallows or the fire. The divine right of kings was not only a shield of power, it was an excuse, a justification, a silent permission that allowed certain men to act in ways most could barely imagine. And over time, behind protection of thick castle walls and a culture of silence, desire began to rot into something else entirely. The court was the stage upon which this transformation unfolded. Ladies in waiting, pages, scribes, and servants all learned quickly not to see too much, not to hear too clearly. Eyes were trained downward, lips sealed tightly, and rumors were often the only form of rebellion left in the castle corridors. Yet the scent of it, of wine, sweat, perfume, and something more carnal, lingered in every hallway. To walk through a royal court at dusk was to hear laughter that seemed too sharp, footsteps that moved too quickly behind closing doors, and whispers that didn't fade with sleep. Power had many shapes in those ancient kingdoms, but few were more intoxicating or more dangerous than the kind woven from desire and immunity. The earliest chronicles speak of kings who kept mistresses in towers, of secret tunnels leading from bedchambers to servants' quarters, of fountains not filled with water but with red wine, flowing endlessly during late-night revelries. These stories, half history, half cautionary tale, were not always written plainly, for scribes knew that to pen the full truth might cost them their tongues or their lives. Instead, they hinted, couched their words in metaphor, using the language of myth and allegory to describe real sins committed in real places. But even in such careful writing, the shape of the truth was impossible to fully disguise. In these castles, stone did not just echo with clank of armor or the chants of monks. It absorbed softer sounds, more secretive rhythms, and more desperate sighs. For some kings, pleasure was not simply an indulgence, but a demonstration of control. To take whom they pleased, to command not just obedience but submission, to be feared in the bedroom as much as in battle. This was, to them, another form of dominance, another way of proving that they were not mere men but living gods. And as generations passed and power hardened into legacy, those same twisted pleasures became tradition, carried on quietly, sometimes proudly, sometimes in shameful secrecy. And yet, not all courts were built the same. In some, these indulgences were hidden. A mistress quietly cloistered in a distant wing, or a favored boy slipped away from court before the church could ask questions. In others, it was all but celebrated. Royal bedrooms became stage sets, boudoirs outfitted with carved ceilings and imported silks, filled with music, laughter, and carefully orchestrated seductions. Servants learned to disappear at just the right moment. Guards were posted not to protect, but to ensure privacy. Nobles gossiped with a nervous smile, never certain if the next feast would end in dancing or in exile. The line between pleasure and politics grew thin, then vanished entirely. It was during these moments, late in the night, as fires burned low and tapestries swayed gently in the draught, that the kings of medieval Europe revealed their truest selves, not in war councils or on the battlefield, not in royal proclamations or family portraits, but in the way they reached for another body with no fear of consequence. The world outside their walls could starve or burn, but inside, lust could be dressed as luxury, perversion as privilege, and no one, not even the church, could truly touch them. These were not tales of romance or forbidden love. They were stories of control, obsession, madness, and often deep loneliness. For many of these kings, the more they took, the less they seemed to feel. Desire consumed them not in moments of passion, but in the silence afterward, when nothing could satisfy and no one could say no. Their chambers grew larger, their appetites stranger, their sleep less peaceful. And slowly, night by night, their courts turned from places of art and chivalry to dens of whispered dread. And so we begin, not with judgment, but with quiet observation. This is not a tale told in outrage or scorn, but in slow unfolding, as if we were walking barefoot across a cold stone floor, listening at keyholes, watching shadows dance under a heavy wooden door. For history is not always loud. Sometimes it is the soft breath in the dark, the flick of a candle, the turn of a locked handle. And as we move from one king to the next, from one room to another, we will see how power, once unchecked, turns inward until it devours the very man who holds it. The candle still burns low, its wax softening, its light casting long, wavering shadows along the stone. And as we remain within these quiet royal halls, let us turn gently toward the deeper idea that allowed so much indulgence to flourish unchecked, a belief so powerful and so rooted in divine language that it placed kings not among men, but beside angels. It was called the divine right of kings, a concept that stretched beyond borders, faiths, and eras, lingering like perfume on royal robes long after the words themselves fell out of fashion. This belief, quietly seated and carefully cultivated over centuries, was not simply a justification for rule. It was a sanctification of desire. It whispered to kings that their will was sacred, that their touch could not be profaned, and that their hunger, whether for land, loyalty, or flesh, was merely another expression of God's mysterious will. In this framework, to question the king was to question heaven. If a monarch took more than his share, it was not theft, it was providence. If he demanded the company of another man's wife or child, it was not sin, it was destiny. There was no earthly court to challenge the divine court above, and certainly no servant bold enough to argue with the mouthpiece of God. Thus, the throne became not only a seat of authority, but a shield behind which darker impulses could hide. Some kings, raised from infancy to believe in their holiness, were shaped not into leaders, but into creatures of entitlement, men for whom the world existed to feed their curiosity, their craving, their pleasure. And the more they believed themselves divine, the further they drifted from restraint. This divine insulation created not just an imbalance of power, but a distortion of morality itself. In the kingdom, laws applied firmly to many. Peasants who stole bread could lose their hands, and servants who stepped out of line could vanish without a trace. But the king could step over any line, even those drawn by the church, and still be praised in sermons. Priests might weep for the sins of commoners, while ignoring the moans and cries from behind the chapel walls of the palace. Advisors knew well to avoid speaking too plainly. Ministers learned to cloak warnings in flattery. And those who dared speak of moderation often found themselves sent away, to quieter provinces, to distant crusades, or to graves marked only with stones. It is in this atmosphere that indulgence grew roots. Not quickly, not with loud declarations, but slowly, as vines creep across a wall, covering cracks, darkening windows, softening the light. A small pleasure becomes a nightly ritual. A whispered request becomes an unspoken command. What once shocked the court becomes part of its rhythm, and those who resist it are treated not as moral, but as inconvenient. Over time, what is hidden begins to show through the fabric of normality, a change in who is invited to dinner, a shifting of sleeping chambers, a silence that settles around certain names. Courtiers begin to adjust their behavior to please the king's preferences, and slowly, The palace becomes an echo chamber, filled with flatterers who applaud every desire and servants too frightened to close their eyes. But even the concept of divine right did not remain untouched by history. In earlier centuries, kings were seen as warriors, leaders in battle, anointed by bishops but measured by sword and strategy. Yet as power centralized and monarchs removed themselves from the field, cloistered behind marble columns and rose gardens, their identity changed. The warrior king became the pleasure king, a man removed from mud and blood, surrounded instead by perfumed courtiers, artists, musicians, and lovers. Without the test of war or hardship, many kings turned their attentions inward, toward their own appetites, and outward toward the bodies of others. The court transformed into a stage, and the monarch, divine, adored, untouchable, performed his desires without fear of audience or consequence. This performance did not always involve cruelty. Some kings sought only warmth, a soft smile in the corridor, a hand on silk sheets, the closeness of someone who did not tremble at their presence. Others, however, fed on fear as much as pleasure. Their divinity became an excuse for degradation, a holy mask behind which they could hide their darker longings. The further they were removed from challenge or denial, the more grotesque their needs became. They collected lovers like coins, demanded obedience like prayers, and punished hesitation with terrifying ease. And still, the divine right held firm, an invisible crown upon their heads, one that no bishop dared remove. For those who lived within their orbit, the experience was often confusing, even disorienting. A courtier might be summoned with a smile, lavish with gifts, then cast aside the following week. A mistress might be elevated to nobility, only to disappear when her favor waned. Servants knew to keep secrets even from each other, and mothers warned their daughters to walk quietly, to avoid the gaze of the king unless invited. Some adapted by becoming participants in the system, manipulating their way into favor, using their own beauty or cunning to gain wealth, titles, or influence. Others simply endured, hoping only to survive the court with dignity intact. And what of the kings themselves? Were they truly unaware of the weight they placed on others? Or had they, over time, become so shielded by power that the humanity of others no longer touched them? Some writings hint at moments of remorse. Late-night prayers, sudden acts of charity, bursts of melancholy at the sight of aging faces, or children born of fleeting affairs. But more often, the records describe men who lost themselves in their desires, who believed their hunger was not a flaw, but a feature of their divine station. Even as they aged, even as their strength faltered, the need to feel adored, obeyed, and indulged remained, as if the idea of being denied had long since become unimaginable. So we walk slowly through this world where holiness and hunger share the same crown, where the concept of divinity cloaked men in velvet and sin alike. It is not a world of clarity, but of blurred lines between virtue and vice, between worship and weakness. And as we move forward, deeper into the lives of real kings with real names, we must carry with us this quiet truth, that in the medieval court, unchecked power did not merely corrupt. It reshaped desire itself into something beyond mortal judgment, something cloaked in incense, wrapped in silk, and guarded by silence. And so, with the weight of divine right still lingering like incense in the vaulted chapel air, we now pass through time, stepping softly into one of the more shadowed and unsettling courts of the medieval world. That of Charles II of Navarre, a king whose name will become forever tied to whispered rumors of poison, insatiable cravings, and a mind sharpened more by cruelty than wisdom. He was called Charles the Bad, though few dared utter the title aloud in his presence. And yet, history did not assign him that name without cause. His court, though draped in velvet and layered in ritual, was not known for beauty, nor for brilliance. It was a place where smiles were forced and eyes flickered nervously, a palace of danger wrapped in the trappings of nobility. Born in 1332, Charles came into a world of inheritance and ambition, descended from both French and Spanish nobility, a mixture of royal blood that gave him a legitimate claim to power and a dangerous hunger for more. He was crowned King of Navarre, a small kingdom nestled between France and Spain, yet his ambition stretched beyond mountain borders. He longed not just to rule, but to dominate, to control those around him not through loyalty or love, but through fear. And in pursuit of this control, he used whatever tools he could find, Manipulation, deceit, whispered promises, and when all else failed, poison that flowed like a second wine through his court. But it was not only the political realm that bore the brunt of Charles's darker appetites. Behind the thick wooden doors of his palace, a different form of hunger took shape, one that left fewer written records, yet lingered in the uneasy silences of those who serve him. He was a man who viewed bodies the way an alchemist views ingredients. Tools to be used, rearranged, transformed to suit his needs. Whether it was a young noblewoman at court, a frightened servant girl, or the disgraced wife of a rival, Charles took what he wanted. There are no romantic songs written about his affairs, no misty-eyed poems passed down by court bards. His passion was not the kind that inspired longing. It inspired fear. In the long, cold nights of Navarre, when torches hissed against the wind and guards paced without speaking, the servant spoke only in glances. It was known that one summoned. One did not say no. It was known that to catch the kings I might lead to a life of luxury or a night of horror. Some women were elevated to roles of comfort and influence, but most were discarded like the empty goblets left behind after his drunken feasts. There are stories told in fragments of a hidden wing of the palace, rooms with no windows, where music never played, where those who entered returned quieter, changed, or not at all. Whether these were myths or memories twisted by fear, none can say with certainty. But in courts where truth itself bowed to power, the line between legend and reality often blurred into one slow, dreadful murmur. Charles's obsession with control extended even to the concept of intimacy. He was not a man who shared. He took, and in his mind, each conquest was proof of his dominance, another symbol that no law, no priest, and no man could limit his will. He surrounded himself with those who enabled his desires, advisors who looked away, guards who escorted trembling guests to his chamber, and apothecaries who brewed more than medicines. While poison may have been his tool in politics, it was said that he experimented with it in more private ways as well. Subtle tinctures meant to sedate, to confuse, to bend the mind or body to his liking. Some claim that his lovers awoke with no memory. Others say they never awoke at all. The church whispered about him but dared not act. The Pope himself once condemned Charles's actions from far, describing his behavior as unholy and unworthy of Christian kingship, yet stopped short of direct intervention. His political alliances, ever shifting, carefully manipulated, gave him cover, and his enemies were often dispatched before they could make accusations stick. He was too cunning to be caught, too unpredictable to be controlled, and too powerful to be ignored. Those who crossed him did not survive long, and those who survived learned never to speak his name without reverence or fear. And yet, even a man so steeped in darkness could not keep time at bay. As Charles aged, his body began to fail him, though his mind remained sharp and cruel. He grew paranoid, suspicious of everyone, even those closest to him. His meals were tasted by multiple servants. His doors were locked 3 times over. He no longer trusted touch, yet still craved it. The contradiction left him bitter, angry, and alone. The pleasures that once satisfied him no longer brought relief. The faces that once delighted him blurred together. And so, in his final years, he grew more desperate, not for love or even loyalty, but for the feeling of power that came from knowing others still feared him. It is said that Charles II died a fitting death, wrapped in linen soaked with brandy for medical treatment. The cloth accidentally caught fire, and he burned slowly, screaming into the night. Whether this account is literal or apocryphal, it remains a chilling final image for a man who brought so much heat and fear into the lives of others. A king consumed, quite literally, by the flames he so often ignited in others. But his legacy did not vanish with him. The court he shaped remained haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory. The stone walls that once held his secrets grew cold again. The silks were replaced, the names forgotten, but not the feeling. Not the silence that lingered long after his steps had faded. And in the long reach of medieval history, Charles II of Navarre remains one of its darkest, most disturbing figures. A king who used divine right not to uplift, but to consume. A man whose lust was not for beauty or connection, but for the slow unraveling of others under the weight of his will. As the torches flicker lower in these remembered halls, we step carefully forward once more, For darker kings await us, and the night is still long. And just as the smoke from Charles of Navarre's torch death fades slowly into the cold wind of forgotten corridors, another figure rises from the dark folds of medieval history, not cloaked in poison and plotting, but in staggering excess and the sodden scent of wine-soaked madness. It is to Bohemia now that we drift, to the royal court of Wenceslas IV, a monarch whose reign will be marked not by strategy or stability, but by drunken nights, thunderous laughter, sudden violence, and whispered rumors of hidden chambers beneath the earth, where pleasure did not merely reside, but roared in the torchlight with teeth and velvet. Wenceslas, born into power as the son of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, was expected to rule with grace and greatness. He was given every advantage, titles, education, wealth, and an empire of expectation. But where others might have grown tall beneath such blessings, Wenceslas folded into himself, shrinking from responsibility and seeking comfort instead in the warm, numbing haze of drink and in the open, eager arms of whoever pleased him at the moment. Crowned king of Bohemia at a young age and eventually elected king of the Romans, his early reign carried a flicker of promise. But it was not long before the court began to shift, from polished diplomacy to something far more unpredictable. The halls of Prague Castle, once echoing with chants and ceremony, grew louder with laughter that bordered on madness. Night after night, banquets stretched deep into the hours when the moon leaned heavy against the windows, and wine flowed in rivers down carved wooden tables. Goblets were never empty, and the line between noble guest and paid pleasure seeker began to vanish beneath the music and the gas behind half-drawn curtains. Wenceslas was not discreet. He did not desire secrecy the way Charles of Navarre had. He wore his indulgence like a robe, loosely draped, daring anyone to comment on the stains. His courtiers adjusted quickly, learning to feast longer, drink faster, and smile more often, no matter how exhausted they became. But pleasure, for Wenceslas, was not about company. It was about command, and his court began to shift to reflect this. Beneath the stone foundations of Prague Castle, deeper than the wine cellars and torchlit tunnels, were chambers said to be built not for defense, but for desire. Rumors among servants spoke of underground rooms padded in fabric, of chains that hung not in dungeons for prisoners, but from carved ceilings in private salons. There were whispers of masquerade games that turned brutal, of guests who left bruised and silent, and of strange visitors from beyond the kingdom's borders. Entertainers, yes, but not the kind that performed in the grand hall. Some servants refused to descend to those levels. Others did so once, then left court entirely. No records were kept. Only the mood shifted, slowly, like candle wax softening at the edge of a flame. Wenceslas himself became increasingly erratic. His drunkenness was not cheerful. It was heavy, sometimes joyous and a manic, gasping for way, and other times foul with rage. He could kiss a courtier on the cheek one moment, and throw a goblet at their head the next. Some nobles tried to steer him gently back toward the responsibilities of statecraft, but Wenceslas would have none of it. He declared boredom at councils, ignored dispatches from foreign lands, and often vanished for days inside his private chambers, emerging wild-eyed and disheveled, demanding fresh wine and music. His obsession with flesh and drink grew so large that governing itself seemed a minor inconvenience. He began to lash out at anyone who reminded him of what he was supposed to be. This decay of discipline did not go unnoticed. The nobles, the clergy, and even his own family began to speak in cautious tones about the king's unfitness. His brother, Sigismund, would eventually move to depose him. But until then, Wenceslas was allowed to sink deeper into his world, a world of flesh and fantasy, where a king could do as he pleased beneath the painted ceilings and behind bolted doors. There were stories of women paid simply to stand silent and still while he watched, drinking in the silence. Others were told to dance, to cry, to whisper prayers while he listened with an intensity that frightened more than it flattered. These were not acts of affection. They were explorations of control, of domination wrapped in silk and satin. And all the while, the city outside kept moving, the world continued turning, even as the king behind the castle walls slowly vanished into his own desires. Yet amid all the drunkenness, all the carnality in cavern chambers, there remained one constant truth, that Wenceslas was never fully at ease. For all his indulgence, there was a sadness beneath the wine-stained smiles. He often muttered to himself, paced alone through darkened galleries, stared out windows as if seeing things others could not. Some say he was haunted, not by spirits, but by expectation, by a crown that sat too heavily upon a head too soft to bear it. And in his craving for escape, for warmth, for numbness, he became a parody of the divine king. Not powerful, but petulant. Not feared, but avoided. His pleasure was his protest, and his court became the theater of his slow surrender. Eventually, his rule collapsed under the weight of neglect. His authority was stripped away, his throne undermined, and his influence dissolved like morning mist over the Vltava River. He died not in glory, not even in scandal, but in a quiet corner of obscurity, a once-crowned king who chose intoxication over intention, and whose legacy became a long echo of laughter that never quite sounded joyful. The chambers beneath his court were eventually sealed, the stories passed down only in fragments, too dangerous to write, but too strange to forget. And now, as we leave the flickering torches of Bohemia behind, we step once more into the silence of history, where other kings wait with other hungers hidden behind gold and gilt. The corridors are long, the shadows deeper, and the tale is far from over. Charles II of England emerged from the shadows of exile and civil war with a smile that many would later say never left his face. It was a smile shaped by survival, by the coldness of continental courts and the sharpness of betrayal, but also by an unshakable appetite for indulgence, one that would soon define his reign and ripple throughout the English court like the rich, heady aroma of spiced wine on a winter's evening. The year was 1660, and with the restoration of the monarchy came not only a king, but man long denied pleasure, now determined to never again let it slip from his grasp. His return was not simply political. It was personal, deeply intimate, almost theatrical. Charles didn't just bring back the crown. He brought laughter to a land that had grown gray under Puritan restraint. The court became a place of feasting and flirtation, of music, dancing, and whispered rendezvous beneath embroidered tapestries. And Charles himself, tall and dark and laughing, seemed to be everywhere at once, seducing the nobles with his charm and the nobility with his desires. From the moment he stepped back into Whitehall Palace, the king made it known that his court would be no place for sour faces or somber prayers. The halls that had once echoed with Cromwellian sermons now rang with the soft tapping of court shoes, the low notes of viols, and the melodious lilt of French-accented gossip. Charles surrounded himself with beauty, paintings, architecture, gardens, but above all, with women. His mistresses were not merely consorts. They were symbols of his defiance, each one a small rebellion against the austerity of the interregnum. Chief among them was Barbara Palmer, the sultry and sharp-tongued Countess of Castlemaine, whose influence reached deep into matters of state, and whose presence in courtly affairs was so brazen it was whispered about in the corridors of Parliament itself. Then there was Nell Gwynn, the witty and winsome actress who climbed from the stage to the royal bed with ease, her bawdy humor a perfect match for the king's taste for pleasure without pretense. Louise de Keroualle followed, elegant and refined, with a French grace that wrapped around Charles's heart like silk around a sword. These women weren't hidden away or shamed. They were celebrated, painted, gifted titles and estates, and their children sired by Charles were acknowledged with a boldness that shocked even the French. The court became a living theater, where loyalty was measured not just in battle or law, but in beauty, laughter, and the ability to entertain a monarch who found endless comfort in the velvet folds of pleasure. Even official matters of government were often discussed between stolen kisses and glances across banquet tables. Ambassadors from other nations learned quickly that diplomacy at Charles's court required more than formal letters. It required charm, understanding of subtle erotic codes, and often the favor of one of the king's paramours. Yet beneath this golden sheen of indulgence lay something older and deeper. Charles's pursuit of pleasure was not merely decadent. It was, in its own way, a shield. He had seen his father executed, had spent years in hiding and poverty, had been mocked and betrayed. Pleasure became both armor and reward. It dulled the edge of memory and soothed the scars of exile. The laughter of his mistresses, the feel of their hands, the smell of wine and perfume, all seemed to push away the ghosts that haunted the corners of Whitehall. And so he built his kingdom not on fear or power, but on charm and seduction. He became the Merry Monarch, a name that held within it both joy and exhaustion, delight and defiance. But as with all things, time was patient. The endless revelry began to wear on those around him. Ministers complained of distraction. Nobles resented the influence of mistresses over matters of state. Religious leaders muttered of moral collapse. And Charles, ever smiling, seemed to care little. His charm had become a throne, and he ruled not just with law, but with laughter. Even as the plague returned to London and the great fire consumed its wooden heart, Charles continued to host masques and banquets, as if defying the fates with dance and drink. In the flickering light of his court, it was hard to tell where politics ended and pleasure began. Everyone was part of the performance. As he aged, the sparkle in his eyes dimmed only slightly. His court grew heavier, more bloated with favor and corruption, but the king remained the same: clever, sensual, insatiable. When he finally passed away in 1685, it was said he apologized for taking so long to die, a final quip from a man who had always performed for the benefit of others. His death marked not just the end of a reign, but the close of a strange, shining chapter in English history. The courtiers who once danced in his presence now whisper of reform, of discipline, of order. But somewhere, perhaps in the silent tapestries or faded portraits of his mistresses, the memory of his reign lingered, a soft, scented reminder that power, once wrapped in velvet and laughter, can feel just as real as the cold steel of the sword. And so the tale of Charles II faded not into history books alone, but into perfume bottles and old letters, into fading footsteps across marble floors and forgotten smiles of painted women. His was a kingship not of battlefields or treaties, but of indulgence, longing, and a joy so intense it sometimes masked sorrow. And as the lights dimmed on his era, the scent of pleasure remained in the air, delicate and ghostly, like a candle just blown out. From this revelry, we now drift toward a colder court, where desire turned darker still, and where madness lay behind glittering eyes. While the chateaux of France were cloaked in opulence and ceremony, the reign of Louis XV bore within it a strange contradiction. A monarch hailed as a refined patron of the arts who simultaneously fostered one of the most elaborate secret pleasure systems in European court history. Long after the grandeur of Versailles had reached its architectural peak, a different kind of construction began, quiet, hidden, and steeped in intimate indulgence. Behind the gold-laced halls of the palace, nestled within a section known only to the most trusted courtiers, lay the Parc aux Serfs, a place not for public eyes, but for the king's most private desires. At first glance, it resembled a gentle, manicured retreat, a modest set of apartments just beyond the main grounds. But beneath its understated exterior unfolded a secret world of youth, submission, and tightly controlled erotic rituals, all designed to satiate the pleasures of a king growing weary of ceremony, yet ever hungry for sensation. Louis XV, unlike his great-grandfather Louis XIV, who had ruled with theatrical absolutism, was a quieter man, often withdrawn and melancholic. Yet that melancholy did not restrain his sexual appetite. Indeed, the king's intimacy seemed inversely proportional to his public appearance. The more solemn and withdrawn he appeared before his ministers in the court, the more elaborate and immersive became his private indulgences. It was not simply that Louis desired women. Many kings did. But rather that he required an environment in which they could be shaped and silenced, their presence manufactured not merely for company, but for fantasy. The Parc aux Serfs was not a brothel in traditional sense, for its residents were not paid in coin by the hour. Instead, it functioned more like a harem under velvet wraps, orchestrated through intermediaries who ensured that the women, often startlingly young, arrived at the precise moment their innocence, beauty, and docility intersected. Most of the girls came from humble families. Some were daughters of tradesmen. Others were the offspring of small clerks or servants. They were recruited not through coercion in the legal sense, but through manipulation, promises of wealth, security, and royal favor that dangled just beyond comprehension. Madame de Pompadour, the king's official mistress who had long since ceased being his lover, played an early role in organizing the system, preferring that Louis direct his passions away from dangerous liaisons with noble women. In this way, she retained power while quietly guiding his erotic path. And so it was arranged. Young women were brought to the park, trained to be quiet, agreeable, and attractive, given fine clothing and subtle perfumes, and offered up to the king like gifts too fragile to be unwrapped in daylight. The apartments were discreet, the servants sworn to secrecy, and the king would visit by night, often wearing plain clothes to disguise the full weight of his crown. To those within the court who whispered of it, the park was a thing of both fascination and dread. They knew, but did not speak. Some claimed the king's desires had turned grotesque in his later years, that the age of the girls dropped dangerously low, that the line between indulgence and exploitation had all but vanished. There were rumors of pregnancies, of girls hidden away or quietly married off to distant nobility, their roles never acknowledged in any official record. Even the precise number of women who passed the park remains unknown, lost to time and secrecy, though historians estimate it may have been dozens or more over the years. Each one briefly enveloped in luxury, then discarded as the king grew bored or distracted, their presence erased by a system designed to forget. What made Louis XV's use of the park UX surfs so unsettling was its careful orchestration. This was not the careless philandering of a youthful prince. It was a methodical, bureaucratic indulgence. There were ledgers and household budgets for the maintenance of the apartments, staff rosters to ensure meals were served without delay, and careful notes kept by overseers to ensure no girl caused embarrassment by speaking out. Pleasure had become institutionalized, a private wing of the monarchy devoted to managing the king's libido. And yet, Louis remained emotionally detached from nearly all of the women. Unlike the grand passions of Henry VIII or the obsessive romances of Edward IV, Louis XV never allowed sentiment to compromise the system. His satisfaction was not bound to any one person, but to the perpetual rotation of fantasy, the ever-renewing stage of desire. Even as France edged closer to revolution, and the streets grew restless with the cries of the poor, the park remained hidden, an island of indulgence amid a sea of unrest. It symbolized, in many ways, the worst fears of the Enlightenment critics, that the aristocracy had grown so insulated, so entwined with sensuality and power, that they no longer saw the difference between privilege and perversion. To the public, Louis XV was Louis the Well-Beloved, a title that now seems laced with irony. His people would eventually turn their love into resentment, and that resentment into revolt. The seeds of discontent were watered, in part, by the quiet luxuries of places like the Parc UX Surfs, where young women, too young to say no and too poor to resist, became instruments of a king's fading pleasure. As the king aged, his visits to the park became less frequent. Gout, melancholy, and the creeping hand of death dulled his appetites. Eventually, the secret harem was dismantled, its rooms repurposed, its residents sent away, married off, or forgotten. But the legend remained. And in the dim corridors of Versailles, where the mirrors reflect more than just light, whispers of the park still echo softly, of a time when power meant never needing to ask, and pleasure wore a crown. From the aching decadence of Louis's hidden world, we drift now toward the icy court of Russia, where another monarch's desires would stir the snow-covered silence into something altogether more dangerous. In the cold, shifting shadows of imperial Russia, where the snow never quite seemed to melt from the boots of soldiers, and the scent of iron clung to halls of power, Peter the Great towered over his court not just in height, but in presence. A man of enormous ambition and volatile temperament, he sought to transform Russia from a backward tsardom into a modern European empire. But buried deep beneath his bold reforms and sweeping victories was a mind equally fascinated with the grotesque and erotic. While he modernized armies, built cities, and dissected corpses with scientific curiosity, Peter harbored within himself a darker pursuit, one that found perverse pleasure in pain, in ritual humiliation, and in a sadistic theater of the body that even his closest allies dared not question aloud. Peter was known for his towering frame and relentless energy, but his personal appetites moved far beyond the bounds of decorum. He was not merely a lover of drink, flesh, and spectacle. He blurred them together, making entertainment of degradation and intimacy of torment. His court became a stage upon which he imposed bizarre rituals, many of them sexual and often cruel. One of the strangest expressions of his appetite was the creation of the so-called all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters, a fraternity of nobles and favorites bound together not by politics or family ties, but by their shared willingness to act out Peter's private dramas. They dressed in mockery of the Orthodox Church, their rites an obscene parody of liturgy, complete with crude sacramental drinking, vulgar dances, and staged orgies that would erupt beneath candlelit ceilings as Peter watched laughing, drinking, judging. But Peter did not simply observe. He was an active conductor in these rituals, compelling his courtiers to cross boundaries, to humiliate themselves, and to strip bare, literally and figuratively, under the guise of jest. Women were brought in for Synods amusement, and though some participated willingly in the debauchery, others did so with silent dread, caught between the absolute authority of the Tsar and the cultural cage of their gender. Nudity, mock ceremonies, forced pairings, all were part of the nightly masquerade. Peter found arousal not only in flesh, but in power. The power to demand, to orchestrate, to reduce noble men and women to groveling figures, stripped of dignity and shame alike. It was a court where laughter masked fear, and pleasure was inextricably tied to submission. There are darker shadows still. His treatment of women, especially his lovers, and even his own wife, reveals a chilling fusion of eroticism and cruelty that characterized his reign. Catherine I, who began as a servant and later became empress, bore the weight of his rages and desires alike. Though history remembers her as his beloved consort, Peter's relationship with her was marked by violent swings. Tenderness one moment, accusations and brutal beatings the next. When he suspected her of infidelity, he ordered the execution of her supposed lover and forced her to watch as a warning. It was not love as most understand it, but possession, total, ferocious, and rooted in domination. Even more disturbingly, Peter's fetishes extended into the medical and anatomical realms. He took an unnatural interest in deformities, surgical procedures, and dissection, not merely as a scientist, but, it seemed, as a voyeur of human fragility. He forced his nobles to attend autopsies, made them watch as bodies were opened and examined, and took delight in discussing bodily functions in excruciating detail at his dinner table. Some accounts suggest that these were not just eccentricities, but symptoms of a deeper, obsessive desire to control and consume the human form in all its grotesque and intimate expressions. For Peter, a body was not sacred. It was a puzzle to be taken apart, a vessel to be used, a form to be dominated. And it was not merely the elite who suffered beneath his fetishes. Commoners, too, were drawn into his cruel games. He often took personal pleasure in overseeing punishments, floggings, executions, mutilations, and sometimes administered them himself. Once, when a soldier was sentenced to death, Peter decided instead to experiment. He ordered the man flogged nearly to death, kept alive for days in agony, and then dissected his body before an audience. It was punishment, science, and perverse spectacle all in one, a moment that encapsulates the brutal core of Peter's vision of power. What makes Peter the Great particularly chilling among the monarchs of medieval and early modern history is not only the scale of his violence or the depths of his perversions, but the fact that he embedded them into the very structure of his court. He made cruelty fashionable. He turned sexual degradation into ritual. He clothed fetish in ceremony and wrapped sadism in statecraft. Beneath the iron reforms and glittering uniforms of his new army, beneath the shipyards and academies and maps of modern Russia, lay a heart drawn more to lash than the law. His legacy, like the Neva River he carved into his capital, was shaped by force, but stained by perversion. And now, from the icy corridors of Russia, we drift westward, toward the firelit courts of Central Europe, where a mad king named Vlad would make his erotic madness immortal in legend soaked in fear. As the twilight deepens and your eyes grow heavier, let us slip from the frozen grandeur of Peter's palaces to the shadowed slopes of the Carpathian Mountains, where forests grew thick as secrets, and the scent of blood clung to the bark of ancient trees. There, in the heart of Wallachia, lived a ruler whose name would echo through time not only for his cruelty, but for the dark sensuality he seemed to draw from the suffering of others. Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler and whispered as the real-life inspiration for Dracula, reigned not merely with terror, but with theatrical obsession for pain that bordered on the ecstatic, an indulgence in agony so intimate it blurred the line between punishment and pleasure. His reign, steeped in fear and soaked in myth, was more than a campaign of brutality. It was a choreography of death, calculated and deeply symbolic. Vlad's favorite method of execution, impalement, was no simple or swift act. It was a performance, staged not only to strike fear into his enemies, but also to feed an appetite that many historians now believe was disturbingly personal. Victims were stripped naked and impaled to the rectum or vagina with long, sharpened stakes, the end of which had been blunted and oiled to ensure a slow, excruciating death. The body would slide down the pole under its own weight over the course of hours, sometimes days, while onlookers, and sometimes Vlad himself, watched the suffering unfold like a grotesque pageant. What distinguished Vlad from other brutal rulers was a disturbing calm, even satisfaction, with which he oversaw these acts. He would die in the midst of the impaled, placing his table within view, or even within reach of the dying, as though their last gasps and twitching limbs somehow seasoned his meal. There are reports, however shrouded in legend, that he dipped his bread in their blood. Smiling at the poetry of it, his courtiers learned quickly to keep silent, to mirror his detached amusement, to laugh when he laughed, no matter how many men, women, or children hung skewered in the fields beyond the castle walls. But this was not just a method of terror. For Vlad, impalement was art. The angle of the stake, the height of the pole, the gender of the victim, even the time of day. It was all meticulously chosen to evoke not only maximum pain, but also symbolic dominance. Men were impaled upright, to display their failure to protect. Women, often impaled at a slant, were used as cautionary figures, their agony a warning against betrayal, lust, or disobedience. Pregnant women were not spared, and Vlad found ways to use their deaths as dark moral lessons. In one case, a mistress who dared question him was found to be lying about her virginity. He disemboweled her himself to confirm the truth, and then left her remains as a grim warning to others. There were tales, too, of sensual punishments, of young women stripped, beaten with rods, and paraded before townsfolk, not simply to shame them, but to excite the peculiar taste of their ruler. He would interrogate them himself, his questions slow, his eyes fixed, enjoying not the answers but the trembling responses, the tearful apologies, the way power manifested in the way they knelt. The punishment was never just about the crime. It was about theater, about control, about the intimate transaction of fear and dominance. The towns and villages beneath his rule pulsed with silent terror. Yet Vlad was not considered mad by his people. He was feared, yes, but also praised for enforcing order. And in that strange paradox lies the heart of his power. He used perversion as governance. His enemies, mostly Turkish invaders and domestic rivals, were dealt with in even more imaginative ways. He impaled an entire Ottoman envoy for refusing to remove their turbans, hammering the cloths into their skulls with nails. The message was clear. Not even God, not even custom, was beyond his reach. Vlad did not merely kill. He branded, he violated. He posed corpses like statues in a gallery of horror. And beneath the surface of these acts, one finds a sickly glow of something deeper. Something not just cruel, but hungry. Vlad's rituals suggest more than just political violence. They reveal a man who found an erotic intimacy in domination. There is something deeply carnal in the way he lingered in the presence of the dying, in the tactile nature of his methods, in the way death became an extension of his will, and suffering became a reflection of his own dark pleasures. It is not so difficult to see why legends of vampirism grew around him. He did not simply spill blood, he indulged in it. His thirst for control was as physical as it was psychological, and the boundaries between sadism and sexuality were blurred beyond recognition. And so, under moonlight and overshadowed earth, the peasants of Wallachia would whisper their prayers and bolt their doors, knowing that even silence might not save him from becoming part of Vlad's next macabre feast. In the forest outside his castle, the birds did not sing. Only the wind spoke. And sometimes, when it was still, you could hear the low groan of the impaled, their bodies swaying gently like obscene pendulums beneath the stars. And from these blood-drenched hills, where pain became poetry and death became desire, our weary gaze now turns to the decadent halls of France, where a nobleman named Gilles de Rice would descend into nightmares darker still, his lusts painting tragedy upon the tender faces of innocence. As the candlelight of Wallachia fades behind us, flickering against the image of forests choked with stakes and the echoing cries of the dying, we find ourselves now drifting westward across Europe, across jagged ranges and moss-draped valleys, until we reach the soft, undulating countryside of 15th century France. Here, beyond a foggy Loire River and nestled within the walls of elegant chateaux and noble courts, lived a man whose name still causes discomfort when whispered in quiet halls. Gillis de Rice, knight nobleman, and once a celebrated companion of Joan of Arc, would ultimately become infamous not for valor, but for the unfathomable horrors he committed behind stone walls and velvet curtains. His was a story of terrifying contradiction. A man born into privilege and refinement, who surrendered utterly to perverse obsession, transforming his vast estates into chambers of ritualistic, often sexualized death. Gillis was not always a monster, or at least not visibly so. In his youth, he was a darling of the French court, handsome, articulate, and absurdly wealthy. He dressed in robes laced with gold thread, paraded through towns on horseback accompanied by hundreds of liveried servants, and hosted theatrical performances on his own dime, complete with elaborate stages and actors. But even as he stood beside Joan of Arc in the heat of battle, something cold and rotten festered behind his noble smile. When Joan was burned at the stake and the tide of war turned, Gillis retired to his estates, where his brilliance curled into madness, and from madness into cruelty. What began as an eccentric love of alchemy and mysticism quickly became a desperate, degenerative spiral. Gillis sought communion with demons, engaging occultists and charlatans who promised him wealth, knowledge, and eternal youth, but only if he made offerings worthy of such power. Thus began the murders, secret, frequent, and unspeakably vile. His victims were almost always young boys, often beggars or peasant children lured into his castle with promises of food or coin. Once inside, they were dressed in fine clothes, pampered with flattery and wine, until the doors were bolted, the tapestries drawn, and the ritual began. The specifics of his crimes were detailed later in court with such horror that even hardened soldiers wept. Gillis would bind the children, strip them, and sometimes fondle them before plunging a knife into their hearts or slitting their throats. But that was not the end of it. He delighted in watching them die slowly, and seeing the life drain from their wide, terrified eyes. He was known to kiss their lips as they convulsed, or place his cheek against theirs as their bodies stiffened. He performed these acts with a sickening tenderness, stroking their hair, whispering reassurances, all while preparing their small bodies for dismemberment. Some accounts suggest he even pleasured himself during or after murders, confirming the deep and disturbing connection between his sexual desires and the act of killing. After death, the bodies were treated with a macabre care. Gillis would sometimes dissect them, removing organs or draining their blood into chalices, as though part of a twisted sacrament. Other times, he would burn them in large fireplaces or bury them in shallow graves on the estate. Servants were sworn to secrecy, and many aided him either out of fear or sheer perversion. Over time, he became less careful. The sheer number of missing children could no longer be explained away, and rumors swirled through the villages like smoke. Parents warned their sons not to wander near the chateau. Travelers gave the estate a wide berth. Yet Gillis remained untouchable, his nobility shielding him from scrutiny, his past glories still remembered by the court. But eventually, even the veil of aristocracy began to fray. Accusations mounted. Witnesses came forward. Bones were found buried in the woods and basements. The church intervened, and Gillis was arrested. His trial, which spanned weeks, revealed not just the scale of his crimes, estimated to be between 100 and 200 murdered children, but also the depravity of his soul. He confessed in great detail, describing his own arousal during the killings, the thrill he felt at overpowering innocence, the way beauty faded in the face of death. His words were not those of remorse, but memory, like a man recounting a long series of forbidden pleasures. At last, on October 26, 1440, Gillis de Rice was hanged and burned, his body consumed in the very flames that had licked the flesh of his victims. Some say he repented at the last moment. Others believe the fire could never have burned away the darkness that had nested in him for so long. What remains of his legacy is confusion. How could a man once honored as a hero of France become its most reviled predator? And was it the loss of war or the weight of wealth, or the thrill of secrecy that brought him to ruin? In the end, perhaps the most chilling part of Gillis de Rice was not just the pain he inflicted, but the intimate, ritualistic joy he took in it. The way death became not just a means of control, but an extension of lust. His crimes were not just murders, but expressions of desire, of power, and of something profoundly broken in the human heart. His castles now stand in ruin, the stones darkened not by moss or time, but by memory, by the echo of cries that once reverberated through their lonely corridors. And now, as we drift farther into the night, into deeper, murkier waters, our thoughts turn to a king not hidden away in estates or castles, but one who ruled an empire with both crown and carnal desire. He reigned in Persia, and his name, Shah Abbas, would become synonymous with obsession, betrayal, and a different kind of perversion entirely, as the echoes of Gillis de Rice confessions fade into the night. Each word dripping with indulgence and the stench of rot, we drift further east, away from the cold stones of France, and into the golden, perfumed halls of favored Persia, where another kind of decadence unfolded. It is the late 16th century now, and beneath the glimmering mosaics of Isfahan's palaces and the soft rustle of silken curtains, a new figure commands our attention. He is no ordinary monarch. Shah Abbas the Great, as history remembers him, was a ruler of cunning diplomacy and ferocious ambition, a builder of roads, patron of the arts, and the architect of a glorious Persian Renaissance. But behind the jeweled veil of imperial grandeur, Shah Abbas bore private obsessions that twisted the intimacy of court life into something stranger, more possessive, and often disturbingly manipulative. To the world, Abbas was powerful beyond question. His empire stretched wide, his armies were feared, and his cities bloomed with color and commerce. Yet beneath this gilded exterior lay a court governed by strict codes of beauty, loyalty, and eroticism, rules that Abbas himself wrote, bent, and enforced as he saw fit. He was known for his attraction to male beauty, particularly that of young boys and adolescent men, a preference that was both indulged and institutionalized within his court. The pages of Persian poetry and paintings from the era often depict elegant youths with soft, androgynous features, rosy cheeks, almond eyes, and flowing garments, idealized images of the beauty Shah Abbas sought and surrounded himself with. But this admiration was never simple flattery. Within Abbas's inner circle, male courtiers, particularly those chosen for their looks, were not merely attendants, they were possessions. Hand-picked from across the empire, these boys were brought into the palace at young ages, trained in etiquette, poetry, and often in the unspoken arts of pleasing the Shah. Some were former slaves, others noble-born captives. They were treated lavishly, dressed in finery, and paraded before guests like glittering trophies. Yet their status was precarious. They could be favored and pampered one day, cast aside, or quietly removed the next, depending on the shifting winds of Abbas's desires. The Shah's sexual interest in these boys was not hidden, but neither was it freely acknowledged in official records. Persian court culture at the time embraced a certain romantic idealism between older men and younger boys, a tradition embedded in poetry and art, but Abbas pushed this ideal into a realm of dangerous control. He grew paranoid over loyalty, obsessed with maintaining power not just through politics, but through emotional domination. Many of these boys were isolated, severed from their families, and made dependent on Abbas for identity, safety, and meaning. Those who fell out of favor might be reassigned to remote provinces, quietly imprisoned, or worse, disappeared altogether. Abbas's personal life also bore traces of a deeper, perhaps even tragic, sexual obsession. In his later years, fearing plots from within his own bloodline, he took brutal measures to eliminate any potential rivals. One by one, he had his sons blinded, his own flesh and blood rendered incapable of ruling, not for crimes committed, but merely for existing, for being potential threats to the singular throne he guarded so jealously. It is difficult to determine whether these actions were driven purely by political paranoia or if they were part of a larger psychological pattern. A king so consumed by control and aesthetics that he could not tolerate any image of strength but his own. The same young men he adored, he controlled completely. The sons he feared, he destroyed without remorse. Visitors to his court often left perplexed, struck by the tension between the court's elegance and the subtle, ever-present danger beneath it. Poetry flowed freely, wine was poured in golden goblets, and the scent of roses filled the air. Yet beneath every smile was a careful calculation, a fear misstep, of falling out of favor with a king whose affections, like his judgments, could turn with terrifying speed. And so Abbas became not just a king, but a collector of beauty, a sculptor of courtly desire, and a destroyer of autonomy. His obsession with male beauty was not mere attraction. It was a way of shaping the world around him into an echo of his own fantasies, polished, perfect, and entirely under his control. Even in death, Abbas's legacy remains paradoxical. He is remembered as a reformer, a savior of Persian pride. Yet the corridors of his court whispered of pain, of lives molded and shattered by the whims of man who saw desire not as love, but as possession. His empire flourished in silken poetry, but behind the curtains, shadows danced. A procession of boys who learned too early that beauty, in the hands of power, is both a crown and a curse. And now, as the incense burns low and the starlight dims over Persia's domes, we float next to a colder, harsher throne, one seated atop frozen lands and forged through fear. Ahead of us waits a czar whose brutal legacy of sexual cruelty and madness would drown even the finest velvet in blood. We step now into the world of Ivan the Terrible, whose name was not given lightly. As the soft silk of Persia slips away and the golden domes of Isfahan fade into mist, a colder wind begins to rise, carrying with it the howl of wolves, the rattle of chains, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of blood. We now drift northward, over frozen rivers and snow-covered forests, into a land where winter lingers long and heavy, and where mercy was not a word spoken often in royal courts. It is Russia in the 16th century, and the throne belongs to a man feared by his enemies, tormented by his own demons, and remembered through centuries not by admiration, but by terror. Ivan IV Vasilyevic, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, did not simply rule Russia. He carved his name into it with fire and steel, leaving behind a legacy so stained with brutality that even the darkest monarchs of medieval Europe pale beside him. Ivan's reign was marked by endless contradictions. Intellect paired with madness, devotion to religion twisted into fanaticism, affection turned to uncontrollable rage. He saw himself as a divine ruler, chosen by God and justified in all acts, no matter how horrific. And perhaps it is within this delusion of divine righteousness that the most disturbing parts of his personal life took shape. For Ivan's court was not just a place of governance. It was a theater of pain, control, and carnal domination, where women were little more than tools for pleasure or suspicion, discarded at will and replaced without hesitation. His obsession with purity and betrayal ran deep. Ivan married not once or twice, but at least 8 times, though some accounts whisper of even more secret unions, each one a product of paranoia or lust. His first wife, Anastasia, is remembered as the only woman who truly tempered his cruelty, and after her death, likely by poisoning, his descent into violence grew uncontrollable. Convinced that the boyars, Russia's nobility, had murdered her, Ivan turned his grief into hatred and his suspicions into purges. And in the chaos of his vengeance, women became both the reward and the victim, offered to him like gifts, sometimes abducted from noble families and subjected to his shifting moods. Ivan's taste in women was not limited to the noble or the willing. He was known to prowl the streets of Moscow disguised as a commoner, accompanied by a secret police, the dreaded operniki, searching for young girls who caught his eye. These girls, some barely into adolescence, were often seized from their homes, brought to the Kremlin, and forced into the Tsar's chambers, where they would be violated under the pretense of royal selection. Some were allowed to return to their families after one night, forever scarred and silenced. Others disappeared, never seen again. His violence was not only sexual but spiritual. He viewed his own desires as sacred, his actions unquestionable, and any woman who displeased him was accused of witchcraft, disloyalty, or treason. And it was not just the women who suffered. Ivan's lust was laced with suspicion and control. His later wives were imprisoned or sent to nunneries when they failed to produce heirs, or simply when his affection soured. One, Maria Dolgorukia, was drowned by his order on their wedding night after he claimed she had not been a virgin. Another, Anna Koltovskaya, was forced into a convent after failing to give him a child. His marriages were not unions. They were trials, and his queens walk a knife's edge, never knowing when his gaze might turn from passion to execution. Perhaps the most chilling tale, the one that has survived in the bones of Russian history, like a splinter that cannot be removed, is the murder of his own son. In a fit of rage, Ivan struck the young prince, his heir, with a staff, killing him instantly. The moment is etched into paintings, literature, and legend, a father cradling the lifeless body of the only son he truly loved, his scream echoing to the palace halls. Too late for forgiveness. It was a moment born of the same uncontrollable fury that had fueled his reign, the same fury that had taken countless lives, ravaged cities, and violated women. a fury that even Ivan himself seemed unable to understand, let alone control. And yet, for all his atrocities, Ivan was deeply religious. He built churches, fasted regularly, and confessed his sins, though never the ones we might think unforgivable. In his mind, his enemies were demons, his pleasures were God's will, and his sins were weapons in the service of divine justice. This blend of sanctity and savagery, of prayer and perversion, made him not just a terrible king, but a terrifying man. The lines between his faith and his lust, his justice and his cruelty, were blurred beyond recognition. In the end, Ivan died as he lived, paranoid, haunted, surrounded by whispers and shadows. His court had become a palace of ghosts, filled with women whose names were forgotten and sons whose lives had been snuffed out too soon. And as we drift away from the frostbitten towers of Moscow, the echoes of his madness fade like a dying wind, leaving behind only silence and the memory of a ruler who turned his kingdom into a prison of fear. Now, as the cold recedes and new scent rises, of salt, sweat, and southern seas, we find ourselves sailing toward the sun-baked lands of Naples and the corrupt courts of southern Italy, where another monarch waits. A man whose lust defied law, church, and morality. A prince raised by popes, bound by no vows but those of pleasure. And so, we approach the decadent world of Ferdinand I of Naples, whose appetites would shame even the gods of old. The sails creak gently as we glide southward, leaving behind the blood-stained iciness of Ivan's court and sailing now to warmer shores, where orange blossoms sweeten the breeze and marble palaces shimmer under a golden sun. Yet, do not be lulled by this beauty, for the light of Naples hides shadows even darker than Russia's winter. Beneath the elegance of Renaissance villas and serenades echoing down narrow alleys lies the palace of a king whose cruelty was not cold and distant, but intimate, cunning, and wrapped in a robe of velvet pleasure. Here, in the vibrant court of 15th century Naples, we meet Ferdinand I of Naples, a monarch whose charm concealed a deeply perverse mind and whose taste for violence was theatrical, personal, and relentless. Ferdinand, also known as Ferrante, ruled with a smile that disarmed courtiers and a sense of justice that chilled even seasoned noblemen. His kingdom was one of flourishing art, diplomatic intrigue, and hidden dungeons, where screams echoed not in defiance but as part of a performance. To the outside world, Ferdinand was a patron of beauty and sophistication. He welcomed poets, scholars, and artists to his court. He admired sculpture, hosted masquerades, and surrounded himself with the luxuries of high culture. But this was only a mask, one worn comfortably, expertly, and used to disguise the true nature of his court, a theater of torment. Ferdinand's reign was defined not just by political ruthlessness, but by the unique way he turned punishment into pageantry. Those who crossed him, or whom he merely suspected of disloyalty, were not simply executed. No, that would be too simple, too forgettable. Instead, he built a private museum of death deep beneath his palace, a dungeon lined with the mummified corpses of his enemies, dressed in their finest clothes and positioned as of a court, still attending his royal functions, eternally obedient, forever silent. Visitors to this macabre gallery were sometimes forced to walk its length as a warning, an invitation of loyalty, or a preview of their future. His cruelty extended beyond these preserved terrors. Ferdinand was known to personally oversee tortures, selecting instruments with the same delicacy one might use to choose a fine wine. He enjoyed watching the unraveling of a human spirit, especially when the victim had once smiled in his presence or shared his table. It was said that his gaze, fixed and calm, could unnerve even his executioners. He believed in justice, but only his version of it, which was theatrical, prolonged, and perversely artistic. And within this court of elegant sadism, women were not spared. While not as openly promiscuous as other monarchs, Ferdinand viewed female beauty as yet another thing to control, display, and discard. Noble women who displeased him or their families were punished through humiliation, sometimes paraded in rags through the streets, sometimes sent to convents that more closely resembled prisons. His spies monitored their conversations, their glances, even their moods. Any whiff of dissent, any rumor of betrayal, was enough to draw them into the spiral of his punishments. It was not just about sex or passion. It was about domination. In his court, to be loved by the king was dangerous, but to fall from favor was worse. A mistress could be embraced in silks one day and strangled with them the next. What made Ferdinand's world so chilling was not just the cruelty, it was the elegance of it. Everything was planned, rehearsed, executed with a level of precision that made it seem more like a twisted ballet than a court of law. Even death, in his eyes, had to be beautiful. And still, the people loved him or feared him so completely that they could not tell the difference. Naples under Ferdinand flourished economically, and art continued to bloom. But behind the public success was a monarch whose love of control infected every corner of the kingdom. Friends were made to spy on friends, husbands on wives. No one was safe. His court was not merely corrupt. It was saturated with fear disguised as glamour, submission masked as courtly ritual. When Ferdinand died, many of his enemies rejoiced, though in whispers, for the culture of paranoia he created did not die with him. His legacy was that of a king who turned cruelty into theater, whose punishments became legend, and who made the very walls of his palace complicit in his crimes. Even centuries later, the stories of his mummy chamber, his smiling executions, and his sinister elegance continue to haunt southern Italy like a lingering poison in the soil. And now, as our ship once more set sail, this time westward, we prepare to cross the Pyrenees into the stormy lands of Castile, where power wore piety like armor and lust was cloaked in righteousness. There, another monarch waits. A queen this time. One whose obsession with religious purity masked a disturbing cruelty toward anyone who stood outside her vision of faith. And so, we drift toward Isabella I of Castile, whose holy mission was written in blood and fire. The ship's wooden hull groans under the soft hush of wind, and the scent of salt yields to something sharper now, something scorched and faintly metallic, as though fire had been lit not for warmth but for judgment. We have drifted west from Naples, carried by time as much as tide, and arrived in the sun-beaten kingdom of Castile. Here, the sky is wide and blue, but it offers no comfort. The air is dry, the streets patrolled not by soldiers but by whispers, and every door seems to conceal a trembling secret. This is the realm of Queen Isabella I, a monarch who claimed her throne in the name of heaven, but whose methods were forged in something far colder and more earthly: absolute control. She is remembered by many as the Mother of Spain, the queen who united a fractured land and set the course for empire. But the truth, as it so often does, lies in the details. The soot smudged on parchment, the claws hidden beneath the velvet glove. Isabella's reign was one of piety and purging, of moral exactitude taken to brutal extremes. While others flaunted their lust or swam in scandal, her perversions were quieter, more righteous, and far more terrifying. Her greatest pleasure, it seemed, was the transformation of belief into submission and of guilt into obedience. Isabella was no whoremongering monarch, no glutton of flesh. Her sensuality came not from indulgence but from restraint. Her passion was for uniformity, for obedience, for cleanliness, spiritual and cultural. To disobey her vision of divine order was to stand naked before fire, both metaphorically and literally. Her court was a garden of rigid symmetry, where every flower was inspected for thorns, and those found lacking in the proper bloom were torn up by the roots and burned. The scent of roses mingled with smoke. Her chosen instrument for reshaping her kingdom into this holy model was the Spanish Inquisition, a tribunal not of justice, but of terror cloaked in scripture. It began slowly, like a rumor. A few arrests here, a few disappearances there, but soon it expanded like a sickness. The accused were often Jews who had converted to Christianity, or Muslims who had accepted baptism under duress. They were called conversos, and Isabella distrusted them deeply. It was not enough to change your name or faith. You had to change your blood, your memories, your soul. And even then, she would still watch you. Interrogations were carried out in secret chambers, far from the gaze of mercy. Victims were tied to pulleys, stripped of clothing, dignity, and identity. They were subjected to pain not merely to extract confessions, but to crush resistance, to deform the spirit until it could no longer remember its shape. Torture was methodical, almost administrative. Records were kept in neat handwriting. The flames were stoked by monks in prayer. But this was not chaos. It was order, crafted and enforced by Isabella's iron sense of righteousness. Her rule was not perverted in the sense of wild licentiousness, but in its distortion of virtue. She turned faith into a knife, forgiveness into fire, and love of God into a weapon of surveillance. Her control extended into marriages, births, baptisms, and even what language was allowed in public. Everything had to be pure. Everything had to match the ideal she had imagined. A kingdom with one tongue, one faith, one queen, and one God. Hers. And like many who claim to defend holiness, her purity masked darker contradictions. Power was hoarded by her inner circle. Cardinals, inquisitors, and confessors who moved through her court like phantoms in red silk. Their influence bought not with coin but with suffering. Children were taught to report their parents, servants to betray their masters. Even love became suspect, as affections not sanctioned by Scripture were branded as sins. In this garden of control, nothing grew unless she approved of it. Her husband, Ferdinand II of Aragon, ruled beside her, but it was Isabella who whispered policy into the mouths of priests. She chose when to be soft and when to be steel. Her smile could comfort, but her gaze could petrify. She may have dressed modestly, avoided courtly excess, and projected the image of chastity, but she ruled with a fervor that was every bit as invasive, manipulative, and obsessive as the most lecherous king's pursuit of flesh. And then came the final act of her cleansing, the expulsion of the Jews. In 1492, the same year she sent Columbus across the Atlantic, she ordered every Jew in Spain to convert or leave. Centuries of coexistence ended in a storm of grief, dislocation, and confiscated property. Entire families fled into the unknown, their wealth seized, their communities shattered. The Spain that emerged was poorer in culture but richer in uniformity, exactly as she wanted. Isabella died still believing in the righteousness of her mission. Her tomb is carved in alabaster, her face serene in eternal rest, as though she never heard the scream she caused. But the legacy of her perversions, the Inquisition, the burnings, the fear, lived on long after her flesh had turned to dust. Her kingdom became a warning wrapped in gold, that tyranny need not come with madness or debauchery. Sometimes it comes in silence, dressed in white, holding a crucifix. And as we drift further down the winding river Time, away from the firelit halls of Castile and toward the emerald hills of Scotland, we prepare to meet a monarch whose name has become synonymous with scandal and conspiracy. A queen this time, again, but one whose sensuality and ambition stir hearts and daggers alike. Her life was painted in lust, betrayal, and death. And so, the soft rain begins to fall as we near Mary, Queen of Scots, whose passions shaped her downfall. The mist rolled in gently from the Scottish Highlands, wrapping the hills in veils of grey and casting the lochs into mirrors of melancholy. The land seemed built from shadows and secrets, and at the heart of it all stood a queen, beautiful, tragic, and endlessly entangled in webs both political and intimate. Mary, Queen of Scots, was born to rule but destined to suffer, her life a delicate dance between power and passion, loyalty and lust, politics and personal ruin. Unlike Isabella, whose perversion was one of righteous control, Mary's legacy dripped with a different kind of scandal, the kind shaped by bedsheets and whispered meetings in dark corridors. Her rule was not built on bloodied parchments or inquisitorial torches, but on the trembling threads of love, betrayal, and obsession. Mary ascended the throne of Scotland as an infant, born into chaos and expectation. She was beautiful, almost dangerously so, with red gold hair, alabaster skin, and eyes that held both mystery and melancholy. But beauty in a queen is a double-edged sword, especially in an age when a woman's body was not only her own, but also a political weapon. Her marriages were negotiations, her courtships whispers of alliances, and her womb the battleground for dynastic control. It was in France, far from the cold stones of Edinburgh Castle, that Mary first learned the art of royal seduction. Sent there as a young girl to be raised in refinement, she was married to the sickly Dauphin Francis, heir to the French throne. Their union was one of youthful innocence, more ceremonial than sensual. But after Francis died suddenly, leaving Mary a widow at just 18, her fate changed course dramatically. She returned to Scotland, older, more aware, and already haunted by the ghosts of thrones she had briefly touched and lost. Scotland welcomed her with suspicion rather than celebration. The court she inherited was divided, her nobles ambitious and untrustworthy, and her people torn between Catholic loyalty and the rising tide of Protestant reform. Into this tempest, Mary brought with her grace, charisma, and a dangerous appetite for love, for companionship, and perhaps for too much trust. Her reign would not be shaped by purges or doctrine, but by desire, and desire in her world could be fatal. Her second marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, seemed promising at first. Darnley was of royal blood, handsome, and a potential unifying figure. But Mary soon found herself bound to a man more suited to drunken brawls than the subtleties of statecraft. Darnley was vain, jealous, and unfaithful, a prince in title but a brute in temperament. He publicly humiliated Mary, demanded power he did not earn, and undermined her rule with reckless arrogance. The queen, who had sought him a partner, found instead a rival, and one increasingly dangerous. What followed was a spiral of betrayal that reads like a tragic play. Darnley grew suspicious of Mary's relationship with her private secretary, David Rizzio, an Italian court musician and confidant who had risen rapidly in influence. Rizzio's closeness to the queen, and perhaps the way he listened to her as others did not, incited Darnley's wrath. In a chilling scene still recounted in whispers, Darnley and a group of armed men stormed into Mary's private chambers while she was pregnant and murdered Rizzio in front of her, stabbing him over 50 times, his blood soaking the floor beneath her feet. It was not just an execution, it was a message. But Mary, ever composed even in crisis, survived the humiliation and gave birth to a son, James VI of Scotland, who would later become James I of England. Yet the tension did not ease. Darnley became more paranoid, more isolated, and within months, he too was dead. His body was found outside a house that had been destroyed by gunpowder. But curiously, he had not died from the explosion. He had been strangled. The murder remains unsolved to this day, but the scandal it provoked was absolute, and at the heart of the whispers stood Mary, and a man named James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was everything Darnley was not, rugged, commanding, and bold. Where Darnley wavered, Bothwell acted. He became Mary's protector in the aftermath of Darnley's murder, and soon, far more than that. Some say she was abducted and raped by him, then forced into marriage. Others claim she loved him passionately and chose him willingly, desperate for strength in a world of betrayal. Whatever the truth, their union shocked the kingdom. Within weeks of Darnley's death, she had married the man many believed to be his murderer. The fallout was swift. Nobles rose in rebellion. The people turned against her, and Mary, once the star of Scottish hopes, became a fugitive. She fled south to England, seeking sanctuary from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth saw in Mary a threat to her own throne, for many Catholics viewed Mary as the true Queen of England. Instead of refuge, Mary found imprisonment, years of it, in cold castles and stone towers, her freedom traded for the illusion of peace. During her captivity, the letters Mary sent and received became tools of seduction and rebellion. She engaged in secret correspondence with Catholic plotters, perhaps fueled by desperation, or perhaps still clinging to the idea of reclaiming her destiny. One such conspiracy, the Babington plot, would seal her fate. Intercepted and decoded by Elizabeth's spymaster, the letters implicated Mary in plans to assassinate Elizabeth and take the English throne. The evidence was enough for Elizabeth to sign her cousin's death warrant, though she hesitated for weeks before doing so. Mary was executed on February 8, 1587. She dressed in red, the color of martyrdom in the Catholic Church, and met death with a poise that stunned even her enemies. She was beheaded after several strikes, her lips still moving in prayer, and when the executioner held up her severed head, her wig came off, revealing thin, graying hair beneath, a final, tragic unveiling. Mary, Queen of Scots, was not perverse in the traditional sense. Her passions were human, perhaps too human for the poisoned world she ruled. She loved unwisely, trusted deeply, and suffered profoundly. Her perversion, if one dares call it that, was a tendency to place emotion above calculation, to believe in love in a world ruled by treachery. Her life remains a tapestry of romance and ruin, beauty and bloodshed, a warning, perhaps, that in the courts of kings and queens, love is a blade as sharp as any dagger. And now, as we drift from the heather-cloaked hills of Scotland to the icy halls of Eastern Europe, We prepare to meet a monarch whose thirst for carnal control matched his cruelty, a man whose palace became a prison for countless women, and whose reign was remembered not for laws or glory, but for domination and darkness. Our ship slows, and the wind turns bitter as we approach Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of Pain. The snow fell softly across the spires of Moscow, muffling the sounds of distant bells, and cloaking the city in a veil of hushed desolation. Winter in Russia did not simply arrive. It invaded, wrapping the land in an oppressive stillness that mirrored the reign of its most infamous ruler. Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, was no ordinary monarch. His crown weighed more than gold. It bore the burden of ancestral blood, divine ambition, and a madness that deepened with each passing year. Where other kings issued decrees and conquered lands, Ivan ruled by fear, paranoia, and violence that seeped like frost into every corner of his realm. His reign, which began in hope and ceremony, would end in dread, despair, and the silent wails of countless women, especially those who found themselves trapped as his brides or caught in the shadows of the Oprichniki. Ivan's early years were painted in sorrow. Orphaned young, raised in a brutal court where betrayal was sport and kindness a currency few could afford, the boy who would become Tsar learned early that power was safer than love. He crowned himself Tsar of all Rus in 1547, the first to do so, cloaking his authority in divine right and positioning himself as God's chosen ruler, untouchable, unquestionable, and absolute. But with this crown came a creeping instability. The man who once governed with promise transformed into a sovereign whose mood swung like a pendulum between penitence and unthinkable cruelty. By the 1560s, Ivan had built an empire of terror. Central to his rule were the Oprichniki, a personal militia dressed in black robes like monks, riding black horses through villages with dog heads and brooms tied to their saddles, symbols of their role to sniff out treason and sweep away the disloyal. They were not merely soldiers. They were executioners, torturers, and enforcers of Ivan's most deranged desires. They struck in the night, dragging nobles from their homes, forcing confessions from the innocent, and bathing towns in blood to satisfy the Tsar's insatiable fear of betrayal. But behind their brutality lay another, quieter horror. The fate of the women chosen, no, summoned, into Ivan's court. For Ivan, women were pawns, pleasures, and punishments all at once. After the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan's sanity unraveled further. He believed she had been poisoned by the boyars, and from that moment, trust became a foreign language to him. He saw companionship, yes, but more than that, he saw control. Absolute, unrelenting control. And so began the bride shows. In the candlelit halls of the Kremlin, young noble women from across Russia were brought before the Tsar like livestock. Beauty was prized, but docility was essential. They were paraded, examined, and judged, not by love or virtue, but by how well they might serve Ivan's unpredictable moods. Those who displeased him were sent away in disgrace. If they were lucky, so were never seen again. Others were punished, or even sent to convents for imagined slights. A few were married off to loyal nobles or Oprichniki, but only after Ivan had had his fill of them. The palace became a place of whispers and wary glances. Women walked carefully, never meeting eyes, never speaking out of turn. The Tsar could be gentle one day, lavishing his chosen with furs and feasts, only to have him arrested the next on charges of witchcraft, treason, or simply looking too long at another man. In his world, love was a trap and trust a weapon. And so, many of his wives, he had up to 8, though only a few were recognized by the church, faded into history unnamed, their lives reduced to footnotes of terror. Among the most haunting stories was that of Maria Dolgorukia, a noble woman of unmatched beauty, who briefly became one of Ivan's wives. She was said to have challenged him, gently, perhaps teasingly, and paid the ultimate price. Legend holds that when Ivan suspected she had taken a lover, he drowned her himself, casting her into the cold waters of the Moscow River. Her screams were said to echo along the banks for days, and some claimed Ivan kept a painting of her in his chambers, a reminder not of regret, but of dominance. Yet not all women in Ivan's court were wives. Some were gifts, offered by noble families eager to curry favor. Others were captives of war or pawns in political games. The Oprichniki, ever loyal to their master, often served as procurers of these women. plucking them from estates, villages, or even monasteries, and delivering them to the Tsar's private chambers. What followed was seldom spoken of. Some women emerged pale and silent, others never at all, and when Ivan tired of them, they were cast aside like spoiled meat, replaced by the next trembling offering. But perhaps the darkest tale of all is not the women he used, but the one he destroyed in a moment of blind rage, his own daughter-in-law. When Ivan discovered her wearing what he deemed immodest clothing, he flew into a fury. She was pregnant at the time, and under his blows, she miscarried. His son, Ivan Ivanovich, horrified and enraged, confronted his father, and in a fit of uncontrollable wrath, the Tsar struck him with his scepter. The blow was fatal. Ivan the Terrible had murdered his own heir, and in doing so, ensured the collapse of his dynasty. In the end, Ivan died alone, hunched over a chessboard, perhaps poisoned, perhaps stricken by the same demons he had inflicted upon others. His reign left behind a shattered nobility, a traumatized nation, and a legacy drenched in cruelty. Yet in the corners of old Russian towns and the candlelit shadows of ruined monasteries, stories are still told. Not just the Tsar who killed his own son, but the nameless brides who passed like ghosts through his court. Their faces may be forgotten, their names lost to history, but their suffering lingers in the bones of the land. And now, we must leave Russia's frozen torment behind and travel to the brooding palaces of France, where velvet and perfume could not mask the poison that flowed through royal veins. For there, a queen turned murder into perfume, and the court of Versailles became a theater of intrigue, seduction, and secret assassinations. The air thickens with roses and cyanide as we approach. The sun never seemed to set over Versailles, not because the heavens refused to turn, but because the glow of wealth and artificial brilliance radiated from every marble column, every gilded mirror, every satin-draped corridor of the French court. This was a palace that hummed with secrets, where a smile could conceal a scheme and a perfume bottle could hide death. But long before Louis XIV transformed Versailles into the gilded heart of France, a different kind of queen ruled. One not with sunlight and showmanship, but with shadow, silence, and the delicate, deadly touch of Italian alchemy. Her name was Catherine de' Medici, and though history has cast her in both saintly and sinister lights, what cannot be denied is a quiet terror she instilled in the corridors of power. She was not born into France, but she would shape its destiny more profoundly than most of its native sons. Catherine came from Florence, a Medici by blood, a dynasty steeped in finance, patronage, and political maneuvering. As a child, she had been raised amidst monks, manuscripts, and apothecaries. She watched potions being brewed as easily as bread was baked. The Medici had long been patrons of early chemistry, astrology, and pharmacology, fields that in the 16th century often blurred dangerously into what others whispered was sorcery. When Catherine arrived in France to marry Henry, Duke of Orleans, she carried with her not just trunks of silk and jewels, but a deeper, darker inheritance, knowledge of herbs, poisons, and the subtle art of influence. She was not beautiful, nor charismatic like her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, but Catherine had patience, intellect, and a memory like a dagger, quiet, precise, and capable of piercing when least expected. For many years, she lived in the shadow of Diane, but when Henry II died, impaled in a freak jousting accident, his eyes skewered by a lance, Catherine stepped forward with the calm certainty of someone who had always planned for such a day. She took command of the court, especially when her sons, still boys, inherited the throne one after another in a tragic, rapid succession. France teetered on the brink of civil war between Catholics and Huguenots, and Catherine, now Queen Mother, ruled from behind the veil with one foot in both camps, manipulating allegiances with careful neutrality, and occasionally with something far less diplomatic. It was during these years that Catherine's legend as a poisoner took form. Her interest in perfumes and scented oils was genuine. She imported the finest fragrances from Florence, employed Italian perfumers who made oils from orange blossoms, musk lavender, and myrrh. But these same men, it was rumored, also made tinctures that could stop a heart or rot the intestines slowly over weeks. Catherine's apartments were said to be full of secret cabinets and locked drawers. She had perfumes for headaches, oils to ease childbirth, and vials that needed only a single drop in wine to silence an enemy forever. It was whispered that even the gloves she gifted to certain noble women had been treated with powder toxins that absorbed through the skin. At her estate in Chateau de Chaumont, she hosted gatherings with astrologers, alchemists, and apothecaries, men like Cosimo Ruggieri, her trusted confidant, who read the stars and brewed concoctions behind closed doors. Visitors claimed to smell strange aromas in her chambers, bitter almond, myrrh, and something else metallic, almost sweet. These meetings, though never officially acknowledged, fueled rumors of black magic and necromancy. In truth, Catherine's power came not from supernatural means, but from her deep understanding of fear, timing, and subtle influence. But in a time when anything inexplicable was seen as witchcraft, perception alone was enough to terrify her enemies. Perhaps the most infamous act attributed to Catherine's reign was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. It began as a wedding celebration meant to unify Catholics and Protestants, but ended in rivers of blood. Thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered across Paris and beyond, their screams echoing through alleyways and into history. Did Catherine plan it? Historians still debate it. But what is known is that the killings began just days after she met in private with her son, King Charles IX, and certain Catholic leaders. Whether it was political necessity or brutal cunning, Catherine's name would forever be linked to one of the most chilling events in French history. Yet Catherine was not all steel and poison. She was also a mother, one who wept over her children's deaths and fought to protect their fragile thrones. She navigated a court filled with vipers, using the very tools her critics condemned: cunning, deception, and the subtle suggestion of danger. Her perfume bottles, real or rumored to be laced with venom, became metaphors for her rule. Beautiful, refined, and potentially lethal. Even in mourning attire, draped in somber black, Catherine commanded attention, her every movement watched, every word interpreted with suspicion or awe. As her health declined, so too did her influence. Her last surviving son, Henry III, would die childless, bringing an end to the Valois line. Catherine had outlived most of her enemies, but not the stories. Even today, her legacy is wrapped in layers of myth and misunderstanding. Was she a poisoner? Perhaps. A schemer? Certainly. But also a woman forced to survive in a world that offered no kindness to those without beauty, birthright, or brute strength. In such a place, her mind became her weapon, and fragrance, sweet or fatal, became her signature. And though Versailles would later become the playground of kings and courtiers who used rouge and ribbon to mask decay, its roots were watered by women like Catherine, who understood that real power often came not from swords or thrones, but from the unseen, from whispers, from droplets, from invisible forces that drifted in the air like perfume, and killed just as surely as any blade. But now, as the candles of Versailles flicker and die out, let's turn our gaze to another woman who defied her time, her gender, and her fate, not in France, but in the shadows of the English throne, where suspicion, politics, and poison mingled freely. For next come, in a quiet, dusty corner of English history, where dynasties whisper through crumbling parchments and unmarked graves, there exists a tale of a woman almost destined to be queen, Lady Arbella Stuart, whose bloodline pulsed with royal entitlement, but whose name has nearly faded into shadows. She was born not to rule nor to rebel, but to exist as a symbol, a chess piece in the dangerous game of Tudor and Stuart succession, carefully positioned, quietly moved, and eventually cast aside. Her story is not one of triumph or rebellion, but one of patience, loneliness, and love, the kind of slow, tragic unraveling that history forgets, but dreams remember. Arbella was born in 1575 at Hardwicke Hall in Derbyshire, the grandchild of Bess of Hardwicke, one of the most formidable and wealthy women in England. Her father, Charles Stuart, was the younger brother of Lord Darnley, making Arbella cousin to King James VI of Scotland and descendant of King Henry VII of England. This made her, in the eyes of many, a legitimate heir to the English throne. Elizabeth I had no children, and the question of succession loomed like a storm over the court. Arbella, a mere infant at the time, was considered a possible future monarch by some factions, though she would never truly be given the chance to grasp the crown that hovered just beyond her reach. Unlike her cousin James, who would eventually unite the thrones of England and Scotland, Arbella's life was constrained by expectation and suspicion. She was a noble woman of dangerous lineage, educated, refined, and watched. Always watched. Raised under the care of her grandmother at the richly adorned Hardwicke Hall, she learned multiple languages, classical history, music, and diplomacy. Visitors remarked on her intelligence and poise. Yet beneath the refinement lay a child who understood, even early on, that her life was not her own. Every tutor, every servant, every letter she wrote was filtered through the lens of politics. She was not allowed to marry without the Queen's permission. Every suitor who came near her did so under scrutiny. Elizabeth feared rivals, and Arbella, through no fault of her own, was born one. As she matured, the restrictions only deepened. Offers of foreign marriage came and went, all refused or ignored by the Queen, who intended to keep Arbella single and pliable. Elizabeth, nearing the end of her reign, could not allow potential claimants to multiply through strategic unions. Arbella, for all her grace, was imprisoned by invisibility. No crime, no rebellion, just a silent sentence of royal proximity. Her life was a long corridor of velvet and silence, lined with windows she could not open, looking out on a world she was never meant to fully enter. After Elizabeth's death in 1603, when James VI of Scotland ascended the English throne as James I, Arbella might hope for freedom or favor. After all, they were cousins, blood relatives of the same tangled vine. But James had his own insecurities, his own fears about plots and succession, and saw Arbella not as a friend or ally, but as a threat that needed to be managed. She was invited to court, yes, but kept under surveillance. Her letters were intercepted, her movements restricted. James had survived the Scottish court with a fierce understanding of betrayal, and he would allow no risks, even those who shared his own lineage. And yet, despite the careful surveillance and cautious maneuverings of court politics, Arbella did the one thing she had always been denied. She fell in love, not with a foreign prince or a political ally, but with William Seymour, a nobleman whose bloodline was as dangerous as her own. He was a grandson of Lady Catherine Grey, who had once made her own claim to the throne and been imprisoned for it. Their union, if allowed, would unite two royal lines with claims equal to kings, and that was a risk James could not permit. Knowing this, Arbella and William chose secrecy. In 1610, they married in the shadows, hoping perhaps for a future not governed by kings or councils. But secrecy in the English court was rare and fragile. Their marriage was discovered. James, enraged, ordered them both imprisoned. William in the Tower of London, Arbella under house arrest. Their letters were censored, their visits denied. Yet love, stubborn and soft, persisted. Arbella disguised herself as a man and attempted a daring escape, planning to flee to the continent and reunite with her husband. She reached the southern coast, hired a ship, and waited for William to join her, but he was delayed. Time, that cruel companion, betrayed them. Arbella was captured before the voyage could begin. She was returned not to house arrest, but to the Tower, a prison she would never leave again. There, in a cold chamber of stone and silence, the woman who might have been queen faded quietly from the world. She refused to eat. She wrote letters no one answered. William was eventually released and lived a long life, remarrying and continuing his lineage. Arbella, meanwhile, withered in the darkness, her mind slowly unraveling beneath the weight of confinement and loss. She died in 1615, alone and unremembered, buried without ceremony in Westminster Abbey, her grave unmarked, her name lost beneath the footsteps of kings and queens who never knew her pain. Yet in the corners of that great cathedral, where candlelight flickers against ancient walls, one might imagine her spirit still pacing, searching not for a crown, but for the husband she once loved more than titles, more than freedom, more than breath itself. In the grand tapestry of English history, Arbella's thread is a fine, nearly invisible line, delicate and tragic. She was never crowned, never led an army, never gave a fiery speech from a balcony, and yet she remains a symbol of what it meant to be royal but powerless, brilliant but shackled, a prisoner of both birth and love. Now, as the stone corridors of the tower echo with her forgotten footsteps, let us walk softly toward another tale. Not queens or nobles, but a woman accused of witchcraft in a village too small to remember. In the early half of the 17th century, nestled within the moody fog banks and heather-draped fields of rural England, there existed a hamlet so small that it scarcely appeared on the maps of the time. The villagers called it Thornmere, a scattering of thatched cottages, one leaning chapel, and a stream that curved around the edge of the moor like a silver ribbon unraveling from a forgotten box. Time in Thornmere passed slowly, measured not in clocks or calendars, but by the blooming of the hawthorn, the arrival of swallows in spring, and the gradual browning of wheat in the fields. In such a place, the extraordinary was unwelcome, and the unexplained was feared. And yet, in the heart of this forgotten place lived a woman named Edith Mallow, known all simply as the Witch of Thornmere. Edith was not born to that name, nor did she claim it for herself. She had come to Thornmere as a young woman, nearly 30 winters past, when her hair was still coppery gold and her hands unlined by age. Rumors followed her even then. Some said she had fled a nobleman's house in disgrace. Others whispered a child lost to fever or stolen by spirits. Whatever her origins, Edith settled just beyond the village edge, in a moss-covered cottage half swallowed by brambles and crowned with ivy that never seemed to die. She rarely came to the chapel, never took a husband, and walked the woods with a quiet grace that made dogs whimper and children hush their laughter. But Edith was no creature of darkness. She tended her garden with patience, grew herbs others could not name, and seemed to understand ailments before they were spoken aloud. Mothers brought her sickly children in the dead of night, and she offered teas and poultices that often worked when prayer did not. She never asked for coin, only bread or milk or silence in return. In a world where physicians were scarce and cures scarcer still, Edith's knowledge was both a gift and a threat. She was useful, but frighteningly so. The villagers watched her with a curious mixture of awe and suspicion. Some said she could summon rain or speak to owls. Others claimed she had the second sight and knew which crops would fail or which marriages would end in tears. When old Thomas Green's cow birthed a two-headed calf, it was Edith they muttered about, though she had never gone near the field. And when the miller's wife took sick after a harsh winter and died with a strange rash blooming across her chest, it was Edith's name that passed from lip to lip beneath breath. No accusation was made outright, but the fear was there, quiet and growing like rot beneath a floorboard. Then came the summer of the red moon. That year, the heat arrived early and refused to leave. The wells ran shallow, the sheep grew thin, and tempers wore thin as the dust. One night, a blood-colored moon rose above the moors, casting an eerie glow across the land. The villagers saw it as a sign, though of what, no one could say. And when young Mary Bell, barely 12 years old, fell into a fevered trance and began muttering names in her sleep, including Edith, it was enough to tip the scales. The whispers grew louder. Accusations began to take shape. The vicar, a man more learned in doctrine than in mercy, convened a gathering in the chapel. By torchlight, they recounted all the oddities of the past years. The sick animals, the failed harvests, the bad dreams and unwed pregnancies, and they laid them, piece by trembling piece, at Edith's feet. They sent for a magistrate from the next county. Witchcraft, they decided, had festered too long in their midst. When they came for her, Edith did not run. She stood in her doorway, hands folded before her, as the constable read the charge in a halting voice. Her face was calm, though her eyes, gray as river stone, seemed to pierce through each man's conscience like a cold wind in December. She offered no defense, only a soft smile and a single sentence. You fear what you do not understand. She was taken to a makeshift cell beneath the chapel, her ankles bound in rusted chains. The villagers avoided her eyes, even as they demanded confession. For days she was questioned about charms and spirits, about meetings with the devil, about why she never aged and how she healed the sick. But Edith offered no dramatic tales, no cries of repentance or rage. She only answered in quiet truths, that Rosemary eased memory, that feverfew softened headaches, and that she had no pact with demons, only with the earth that grew her herbs and the skies that brought her rain. Yet the truth mattered little. Trials in those days needed spectacle more than evidence. Edith was paraded through the village square, where children pointed and old women turned their faces away. She was tied to a chair and floated in the pond outside the chapel, an ordeal meant to prove her guilt. If she sank, she was innocent. If she floated, the water rejected her as a witch. She floated, of course, as any half-starved woman might, and the verdict was clear, guilty. But the punishment did not come in fire or rope. Instead, They left her in that cell beneath the chapel, forgotten as summer turned to fall and fall to frost. The village moved on. Mary Bell recovered. The red moon never returned. But Edith remained, a shadow beneath their feet, her voice echoing in the creaks of the chapel floorboards and the rustle of wind through yew trees. Some claimed they heard her singing in the night. Others swore that wild herbs grew thickest above her cell. And one spring, when a fever swept through Thornmere and none of the usual remedies worked, villagers found themselves whispering her name, not with hate but longing. But the door to her cell was locked from without, and no one could find the key. Years later, when the chapel crumbled and the village shrank to just a handful of cottages, a curious boy discovered a skeleton beneath the altar. Around its neck was a simple chain bearing a carved piece of jet, shaped like a moon. No one spoke of it. The bones were quietly buried, and the cottage at the village edge was left to rot. But still, to this day, in the midst of Thornmere, some claim they see her figure walk in the moor at dusk, gathering herbs in her apron, humming lullabies to a world that once cast her out. And so ends the tale of the woman who knew too much. She was not burned nor banished, but silenced, her knowledge buried beneath suspicion, her kindness drowned in fear. The Witch of Thornmere remains a quiet monument to the dangers of ignorance, and the price of standing apart in a world afraid of what it cannot explain. In a time when the night stretched long and quiet over mist-drenched villages, when roads were little more than winding dirt paths and candles sputtered more than they glowed, there lived a woman whose name was spoken in reverence and in fear, sometimes in the same breath. Her name was Agnes Moorcroft, and she was known not simply as a midwife, but as the midwife, summoned from leagues away to usher life into the world with her rough hands and strange whisperings, her satchel of herbs, and her eyes that never blinked at pain. But over time, the villagers who once called on her with gratitude began to tell a different story, one that curled like ivy around cribs and settled in the cold corners of bedrooms where infants never cried. Agnes lived alone on the edge of Black Hollow, a place thick with briars and old legends. Her cottage was simple, a single room with a fire always lit and bundles of herbs dangling from the beams, their scent thick and acrid in the air. It was said she never left home without her crow-feather shawl, worn so long that no one could remember its original color, only that it seemed to swallow light and silence the air around her. She came when summoned, no matter the hour or storm, and always arrived as if the wind had carried her. Soundless, sudden, already at the door before anyone saw her approach. There were those who praised her. For decades, she had delivered babies safely when no one else dared. She helped women in remote cottages, in barns, even the shadow of plague carts. They said she could feel the heartbeat of an unborn child with her palms, that she knew when a mother would bleed or when a birth would be breech, and what to do when it was. She whispered into laboring women's ears, words no one else could hear, and when the babies arrived squalling and whole, she would wrap them in linen, tuck a sprig of rue behind their ear, and vanish before dawn. But sometimes, too often, some began to say, the babies did not cry. They came into the world pale and silent, their lips blue, their skin too cool. Agnes would say softly that the cord had wrapped around the throat, or that the child was not meant for this world. She would hold the mother's hands and close the tiny eyelids with fingers that seemed too sure, too calm. And then she would be gone again, leaving only the scent of burnt sage and the unsettling quiet that follows a scream never made. Whispers began to grow. Some claimed Agnes could choose who lived and who died, that she had made a pact long ago with something neither holy nor earthly, that for every child she brought safely into the world, another was claimed in turn. And when the plague returned, a cruel skeletal hand reaching again into the hamlets and hovels. People noticed something strange. In homes where Agnes had recently visited, the death came slower or not at all, while other families lost 3 or 4 children. Hers, her clients, remained untouched. And while others sobbed in the graveyard, Agnes walked the village square untouched by grief. It was a seamstress, a mother of twins who had died in the same hour, who finally spoke what many feared to say aloud. She swore she had seen Agnes breathe into the mouth of one twin as the other took its final breath. She claimed a shadow had moved across the wall, one not cast by firelight, and that Agnes had whispered not a prayer, but a name. The midwife, she said, was not a woman at all, but a vessel. The village listened. and remembered. They remember how Agnes always arrived before being seen, how she never caught ill, how her age never seemed to change, though she had delivered their mothers, and in some cases, their mothers' mothers. A storm of fear gathered, and as with all storms in small, frightened places, it looked for something to strike. They summoned the vicar, and though he had long relied on Agnes for tea and poultices, he, too, had heard the stories. A tribunal was held, not in a court, but in the chapel, a place that smelled of mildew and old guilt. Agnes stood at the altar, unbound, unafraid. She wore the crow-feather shawl, and looked at each face without blinking. They asked her of spells and sacrifices, of babies not breathing and bargains made. She answered with silence, and then with a whisper. "I take what the world already offers," she said, her voice rough as wind through dry leaves. "I do not choose. I only know, and I do what must be done." It was not the answer they wanted. They could not burn her. There were laws, even in fearful places. But they could banish her. She was sent beyond the moors, her cottage dismantled, her herbs scattered. None dared follow where she went, only that the wind carried rumors still, that in other villages strange births continued, that mothers woke from pain to see a shadow in a shawl smoothing the blankets over a sleeping child, and that sometimes a baby who had not drawn breath opened its eyes after a kiss from a woman with crow-black feathers. Years passed. The old villagers died, and the story became just another tale told by firelight. But the midwives who came after kept a bundle of herbs near the cradle, and some still whispered Agnes's name as a charm, not as a curse, but as a prayer. Because even fear, once softened by time and need, can become reverence. And in the far corners of the land, where frost never fully melts and the night lingers long, they say there's a midwife still wandering. Her shawl rustles like wings. Her eyes hold too much knowledge, and she always knows when a soul is ready to be born, or when it's not meant to stay. As the village of Eldon Hollow slumbered beneath the weight of another bone-chilling winter, frost crusting the thatched rooftops and the trees bending under the snow's silence, there was a figure known not for the life she brought into the world, like the midwife, but for the remedy she claimed could keep death at bay. Her name was Maudlin Thorne, a name once spoken with hope, now murmured only with shiver. She was a herbalist of the region, a woman of earth and plant, shadow and steam, whose cottage always smelled of simmering roots and bitter oils. And for a time, the villagers clung to her cures like lifelines flung across a storm-tossed sea. Maudlin was a creature of twilight. She did not belong to the dawn, with its warmth and noise, nor to the deep midnight, where only the mad or desperate tread. Instead, she lived in the in-between, between sickness and health, between faith and fear. They said she could name every plant by the rustle of its leaves, every root by scent alone. Her fingers were always stained green and brown, her eyes sunken from too many nights brewing tonics and grinding bark into paste. But her knowledge was unmatched. When the fevers came, sweat-soaked, bone-burning fevers that took men in the prime of their strength and left children convulsing in their mother's arms, it was Maudlin the people turned to, not the priest. She would arrive with bundles of strange weeds and dried fungi, her voice low and certain. Her cures were never gentle. There were no sweetened syrups or warm compresses. Her remedies burned the throat, blackened the tongue, and made the stomach turn. She promised that was how one knew the poison was leaving the body. "A healing that does not hurt is not healing at all," she would say, pouring a thick green elixir into a chipped wooden bowl. "The sickness fights to stay. My work is to make it flee." And sometimes, just sometimes, it worked. The fever broke, the eyes cleared, the child stirred. A mother would weep with joy, clutching her little one, swearing that Maudlin was a gift sent from the forest spirits themselves. But those moments, golden as they were, became fewer. More often, the sick turned still after her visit, their faces contorted in agony, their hands clenched, a strange smell lingering in the air. The villagers told themselves that the sickness had been too strong, that Maudlin had done all she could, until they began to notice a pattern. Those who died after receiving her treatments did not just die, they suffered. Their limbs twisted as if in torment. Their skin took on a strange pallor, sometimes green, sometimes gray, and in some cases Blackened patches spread across their bodies, almost as though the herbalist's cure had rotted them from the inside. Some screamed until their voices vanished, and others fell into such deep unconsciousness that they never awoke again. Worse still, animals that licked spilled drops of her mixtures were found dead the next morning, their eyes wide and glassy, tongues swollen. The first to question Maudlin openly was a carpenter named Obram, whose wife had taken ill with a wasting cough. He'd begged Maudlin for help, and she'd given him a powder, bitter, sulphurous, to be mixed with mead and swallowed before dawn. His wife drank it, and by dusk she was gone. Her body was rigid, her lips dark blue, and Bram swore she cried blood before her final breath. When he returned to confront the herbalist, she did not answer the door. Instead, the village awoke to find Bram dead, slumped against a wooden gate to her cottage, his mouth foaming and his skin blistered as if he'd swallowed something vile. Maudlin claimed he had come to harm her, and that she had never spoken to him after his wife passed. No one could prove otherwise. But whispers, like weeds, grew. They said she used herbs known only to the old world, plants that once served not medicine, but witchcraft. They said her garden never withered, even in the dead of winter, that her cat had 2 different colored eyes and never blinked, that birds never landed on her roof, and that children born after her treatments often cried without tears and stared too long into the corners of rooms. One night, a young boy named Edwin, burning with fever, was taken to her. His parents desperate, as all parents are when death taps at the door. She gave him a vial, swearing that it would draw the heat out. The boy drank it, and his screams echoed through the hollow. His skin began to peel, his veins showing like dark threads beneath parchment. When he died, the herbalist told his mother that he had been too far gone, that even the strongest cures cannot raise the dead. But that time it was too much. A small group gathered, men with torches, women with rosaries, children hiding behind fences as the mob moved toward her home. They didn't knock this time. They broke the door. What they found inside chilled them more than the night air. Jars upon jars lined the shelves. Preserved organs, roots shaped like fetuses, mushrooms glowing faintly in the dark. Books bound in hide, filled with symbols no one could read. In the hearth, something boiled that smelled of iron and smoke. And in the corner on a table were the remains of a goat with no eyes, its tongue black and curled. Maudlin did not beg. She stood tall, her hands bloodstained, her eyes as unreadable as ever. She said only one thing. You asked me to fight death, but you never asked the price. They did not kill her. None had the stomach for it. But she was banished, marched to the edge of the forest, deeper than any dare go, and left there, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her book of secrets. She vanished into the trees, without a word. But even now, when fever comes, when mothers cry and the priest has no answers, some say they see her in the shadows. A flicker of movement, a whiff of bitter herbs, a whisper through the leaves. I can help, but not without pain. And they say those who take the cure always pay a price. The first sign that the king had lost all ties to sanity was not the blood-soaked edicts, nor the midnight executions, nor even the unholy feast he threw in the dungeons among the bones of the slain. No, it was something far quieter. He stopped speaking in full sentences. His courtiers, once accustomed to flattery and fear, began to notice that the king spoke only in riddles, half-phrases, words that seemed plucked from dreams or nightmares, stitched together in sentences that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. "The birds will eat my golden teeth," he once whispered during court. "Boil the moon and drink its ash." Then silence. In those final days, he refused to wear the royal crown. It sat askew on the throne, collecting dust. As he wore a crown of thorns, he had fashioned himself from the brambles that surrounded the castle chapel. He claimed the thorns whispered truths to him in his sleep, telling him who among his people was loyal and who plotted against him. None dared ask why his forehead bled each morning or why he wept while smiling. The king's castle, once a place of pageantry, feasts, and foreign ambassadors, had become a mausoleum of fear. The servants spoke in hushed tones and walked as softly as possible, for even a single misplaced breath could end in a beheading. Those who served in the royal kitchens began to vanish, replaced again and again, until none remained who had been there more than a week. The food on the king's table went untouched, often rotting in place, attracting flies even in the deep of winter. And yet he grew fatter, redder, his skin blotchy and swollen, his eyes yellowed from sleeplessness and rage. Some whispered he was being fed something darker than food, that he feasted on his own madness now, spooning it like pudding from the bowls of his crumbling mind. There were no more advisers. Those who had once dared to counsel him now decorated the outer walls, their heads displayed like grotesque gargoyles above the castle gate. He replaced his counsel with shadows, imaginary friends from his youth. Forgotten saints he claimed visited him in dreams, and a fox that he let roam freely through the great hall, whispering secrets in its sharp little barks. It was said the fox was once a man, his last confessor, transformed by the king's dark blessing, cursed to trot his feet, gnashing his teeth at anyone who dared meet the king's gaze. The queen, once radiant and kind-hearted, had long since vanished. Some said she had fled, disguised as a commoner, escaping into the woods with her child strapped to her back. Others believed she still lived, kept in a secret chamber beneath the castle, her lips sewn shut to keep her from revealing the truth about the king's descent. There were even those who claimed she had been the first victim of the king's madness, buried beneath the marble floor of the throne room, and that her screams could still be heard when the wind blew through the cracks. Then came the final week. The sky itself seemed to rebel, cloaking the castle in clouds that never lifted. Snow fell in heaps, heavy and wet, muffling the sounds of the kingdom unraveling. The peasants no longer approached the castle gates. The roads were empty, the fields frozen, the air thick with the scent of iron. The bells of the chapel rang without hands, echoing in the night like warnings from a world beyond. On the 7th night, the king summoned his remaining guards. Only 6 remained from the hundreds that once filled the barracks. He ordered them to the grand cathedral at the edge of the royal grounds. "Burn it," he said, laughing, his mouth ringed with black wine. "The angels have betrayed me. Let them freeze in ash." And they did. The cathedral, built over generations, its spires rising into the heavens, crumbled into fire and smoke. The stained glass saints melted into colorless puddles. The holy books turned to cinders. From the center of the blaze, the king stood barefoot, arms raised, shrieking like a prophet or a demon. "Now," he cried, "they will listen. Now I am the only God that breathes." That same night, the forest moved. It began with whispers, the kind no wind could carry. Then came the groaning of ancient trees, bending not with the breeze, but as if making way. Figures emerged, not soldiers, not rebels. Peasants, women with scarred hands, men with hollow eyes, orphans and beggars, all of them dressed in black, faces masked with soot and ash. They did not carry swords. They carried ropes and sickles and torches. They breached the gates without resistance. The guards, long broken, opened the doors with trembling hands. No cries of revolt, no drums of war, only silence and the slow march of people who had lived too long beneath the boot of a madman. They found the king in the great hall, alone, sitting on the stone steps before the cold throne. He held his thorn crown in his lap, humming a lullaby to it like a child might to a dying bird. His eyes were empty, looking not at the intruders but through them, past them, into some world none could see. "Do you come to kneel?" he asked softly, tilting his head. No one answered. It is said they did not kill him with steel or fire. That would have been mercy. Instead, they bound him to chains once used for wolves and led him to the halls, past the bones, past the throne, past the fox, who whimpered and fled, down to the dungeon he himself had used so often. There they left him, alone, no light, no sound, just him and his mind. Weeks passed, then months. Some said he was still alive down there, whispering secrets to the stones. Others believed he had starved, and that his ghost now roamed the halls in the shape of a man whose face could never be seen. The kingdom changed, slowly, cautiously, as though afraid that any loud celebration might summon him back. Fields were sown again. Children played in the mud. The chapel was rebuilt, stone by stone, though no bell ever rang from its tower again. The forest grew quiet once more. But deep beneath it all, in the cold, forgotten places of the earth, a silence remained. A chamber no one dared enter, a story few dared speak. And so, dear listener, the tale ends not with triumph, nor with peace, but with a slow exhale of history's long breath. The Mad King fell, not by sword or siege, but by the steady weight of his own cruelty. Time swallowed his name. The faces of those he harmed blurred, like mist on glass. But the lesson lingered, whispered still on cold nights. Power, when left unchained, does not simply corrupt. It devours. Now, let your eyes grow heavy, your breath slow. You wandered long through the shadowed tale. Let the final embers fade into darkness, and let the quiet cradle you like a forgotten dream. Sleep well, traveler. Good night.